Hello, BookTube. I have yet another BookTube event announcement video to make. You may have already heard of this BookTube event. It's right around the corner. It's coming up mighty fast, and that's June on the Range, which is masterminded by Michael K Vaughn, as an event designed to celebrate westerns, western novels, western short stories, that sort of thing. Which, as Michael points out in his own announcement video, was once upon a time a massively popular, industry-dominating thing, not only in books, but also in the long tail of books, in movies and on TV. It was just a massive glut. It was utterly unavoidable on TV with The Rifleman or whatever, or Bonanza, which ran for 150 years. Thomas Jefferson was one of its original fans. And also in the movies, where you had, the biggest and most reliable box office draw for a long, long time was John Wayne. And the bookstores reflected that. There were millions and thousands of westerns of all kinds, some of them really junky, others people trying to write stuff that was sharp, intelligent, that respected the intelligence of its readers. That genre is all but dead now. When a Western theme, in other words, well, we'll have to get to defining what a Western is. We'll do that in the course of June. But if we talk, roughly speaking, of the period being roughly around the American Civil War to roughly the end of the 19th century, that 50-year period, where there are still Native American nations who are viable and possess large amounts of territory in the American West and Near West, and where expansion is being pushed and pushed and pushed, where there's gold, and where there are rough and ready men who are riding their horses 1 or 2 days ahead of the establishment of settled law. It was widely viewed in the press, even at the time, that the Transcontinental Railroad and the sort of, what's the horrible word, resettling of all of those Native American nations pretty much ended an era of American history. It did, and that era is kind of the Lothlorien, it's kind of the Arthurian England of the Western setting. And nowadays, if you see a new release that's set in that setting, it will be subversive in some way. It will not be a major work. I mean, a major work of literature that's designed to be in bookstores, designed for you not to hunt around in the genre bookcases down low near the floor, but a major release. Think of something like the Sisters Brothers, or there are a number of examples that we can come up with. I will list them. I will make a video about it. But there are still novels that are set in the contemporary American West in what was once the setting of stereotypical Western novels, but they are always subversive now. They can't not be. Our political consciousness, our political sensitivity has been raised and sensitized over the last 30, 40, 50 years to the point where it's no longer acceptable that your stock villain will be rampaging Indian tribes. That's no longer acceptable. The white people that those Indian tribes were fighting against were stealing their land. Where they were invaders, stealing their land. It's no longer right to do. Also, all of the racial stereotypes that come into that were on full display in, for instance, Western-themed romance novels, where you would have a smoldering Comanche brave or something like that. And way too many of those novels end in some sort of civilizing compromise, where either the young woman is so besotted with her Comanche warrior or her Apache brave or whatever, that she decides to, as many authors put it, abandon civilization and live with him, go native with him. Either that happened, which is mighty darn insulting, or he decided to take up civilization and leave his people behind, which is even worse. so you I don't know if you noticed, probably you don't pay attention to the trends in romance novels in bookstores, but those romances are gone. Just plain gone. There's a way for you to keep doing Viking romances or pirate romances or historical romances in the Regency period. There's a way for you to keep doing all of that. There is no way for you to do, My Apache Stallion. There's no way for you to do that book anymore. And that's a good thing. That's a very, very good thing. It's a good thing that was sort of, unlike in the 21st century, the romance industry voluntarily just sort of, I don't want to use the term, the term is explosive even for me, but the romance industry just sort of spontaneously woke up and said, ugh, yeah, this isn't really a good template for, half our line of romance paperbacks this month. It really isn't. They didn't need anyone to scold them to do that. They didn't need anyone to threaten to burn down their buildings or expose their children at school. They came to it on their own because consciousness has been raised by books like Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, right? Or Custer Died for Your Sins. Great polemics about American Indians that reached the popular consciousness and changed it. So part of that is probably the reason why we don't see the Western genre just dominating the way it used to. Probably part of that is the reason. So probably part of that's good. It's a little bit disappointing to me that not many people have been able to revive the ordinary, standard, moral, popular conception of the Western novel without those things. That's always struck me as a little bit of poor imagination, or maybe it's gun shyness on the part of publishers. But no matter what the reason is, Michael K. Vaughn is right that this genre has fallen into desuetude. It is now an afterthought. No one thinks about writing standard Western novels. And we'll get into what makes a standard Western novel. You know how I like to define things. We'll get into what makes it. What are the essential categories? I'd love to hear from you, so that when I work up a list, I'll of course do a starter kit for June on the Range. But I'd like to do discussions as well about what makes a Western novel. Maybe, possibly, I can wrestle all of our co-hosts for June on the Range into a live stream or a Zoom chat conversation of some kind. Maybe that's possible. They're all really, really busy people, except for me. So it might not be possible. I'd love it, because then we could all talk together, not only about all of our experiences with Westerns in our lives, but also what is a Western? What are the categories that we define it by? Can you take a novel and say, this isn't a Western, even though it fits a lot of those criteria? I'm thinking, for instance, here of some of the novels of, for instance, Booth Tarkington, who, when he was a young man, could still have visited the world that in which most Westerns are set, even though it was already becoming kind of Shangri-La. I don't think many people would say that Booth Tarkington wrote Westerns. I don't think they would. So, or Ham Garland, same way. And Owen Wister, I'm not trying here consciously to list off all the friends of Teddy Roosevelt, but Owen Wister wrote a classic Western, The Virginian. But even when he did that, well, anyway, Michael K. Vaughn, I didn't mean to turn this into a long university lecture. In what way? I meant only this is meant to echo Michael's announcement video for June on the Range. I will list all the co-hosts down below, and maybe a conversation video will be possible. I'm available. I don't know how available they are. But in his announcement video, Michael K. Vaughn said that, there's really no parameters. Just read some Westerns, maybe a good one, maybe lots of bad ones. See what it was all about. Experience this literature that once upon a time everyone read. And that's all well and good, but I like parameters. I like weekly parameters. And Michael doesn't impose any, but he is using some of his own. I thought we'd go over those in case you want them, in case you also like that kind of superstructure in your reading event. And the first one is The Giants. And that is the two names that dominate the genre. They did at the time, and they still do. And that is Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour. They are, Zane Grey in 2020, 2022, probably a little bit less so, but Louis L'Amour is synonymous with the Western. So for week one of June on the Range, Michael is going to read a little bit of Louis L'Amour and a little bit of Zane Grey. Now, I'm going to read only Louis L'Amour. would once upon a time, Louis L'Amour mass market paperbacks were 75 cents. And they had some really stunning cover artwork. So when I was in the bookstore and I was at the new release tables and I was at the normal shelves, but there were spinner racks of what the store considered to be bubblegum literature. I would often get a Louis L'Amour Western just to sort of cleanse the palate, just to read something in between other books that I was reading. So I've read quite a bit of Louis L'Amour, but not all of it. And even the stuff that I've read was so incidental that it could stand to go over it again. So I'm not, right now, without dipping into these things, I'm not 100% sure that the 4 Louis L'Amour novels I have chosen are, in fact, Louis L'Amour novels that I have not read. It could be that I'll get into 1 or 2 of them, or maybe all 4, and see that I have read them. But the one I'm going to start with is The Proving Trail. Then I'll move on to Matagorda. Look at that, huh? Just awesome. Then Guns of the Timberlands. I remember distinctly a different cover than this. I think this one I probably did read. I like this cover, though. Very brooding, how the man on horseback is not the point of the painting. I very much like that. And then this one definitely is a reread. I read this when it first came out, thought it was tremendously ambitious and very, very graphic in parts. This is The Lonesome Gods, which is a sprawling thing. It's 3 or 4 times as long as the usual Louis L'Amour novel. But that don't matter none to me, pardon. So I will be getting to this again. I'm very much interested to see what a reread of this will be like. Then the next week is other classic stuff, other classic Western novels. So the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, but that aren't reprints of Louis L'Amour or Zane Grey. And I found 3 of those today. I may find others. These won't be the only ones. I found 3 of those today at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston. I want to show them to you again because these will definitely be part of June on the Range for the second week. There's Fargo, Massacre River, where he is about to shoot some dynamite out of his gun. Then we have The Manhunter by Gordon Sherriss. I don't think any of these are real names. And finally, Bullets for a Ranger by Bradford Scott. This is a Walt Slade novel. Again, the classic, wonderful cover artwork there. Some of them don't have it, but some of them really, really do. So I'll be reading those for the second week. But then the third week of June on the Range is something more contemporary than that. So relatively new. And that opens up a lot of possibilities because, again, it depends on what we define as a Western. But Western settings are pretty elastic. And there's one author that I have been over the years getting her trade paperbacks from the publisher, I think Kensington. And I read one of them, and every time I get a new one, I say, I really should, instead of stacking these up, I really should read them. I should make the time to read them. And so I'm going to read a swath of this author for the third week in June on the Range. And the author is Lorelei James. Here we have Wrapped and Strapped. Don't know if I'll consider it a Western. Is there a difference between a Western and a novel set in the West? We'll be talking all about it in June. Then another Lorelei James book is Turn and Burn. You can see she's got the same person working on not only her cover art, but her titles. And then finally, Saddled and Spurred. He does not look comfortable. But I'm pretty comfortable looking at him. I don't know what he's doing. What is he doing? So anyway. And then another newer, the last newer thing that I'll read a lot more than these, but hurricane force winds out there. No, that's not going to work here. In fact, let's just fix the problem at its source. There we go. Sorry about that. It's like 2 days in a row that's been true. Another thing one of the other things that I'm going to read for week 3 for newer stuff is to sample some of the Westerns that are still being published. There are 3 or 4 that are published every month. They're in the advanced catalogs. I see them. I don't usually look at them. They're not really meant for review. No one expects you to review them. I think there are probably maybe still surviving a couple of specialty journals that are Western devoted, and that have retrospective articles, but also review everything that's new. That could be true. I'll have to look into that for June on the Range. But I chose an author who's in industry. He just pumps them out. And I don't think I've read more than a handful of this guy's books. The author is William Johnstone. This book says, and J.A. Johnstone, so maybe William Johnstone has passed on the writing mantle to a son or a nephew or a son-in-law or something like that. This is a Will Tanner book. I know he has a lot of those, and this is The Violent Storm. And I don't know what's going on there on the cover. If that's Will Tanner and he thinks that he is hiding from the gunman outside, he's he's got a quarter of his body visible through the window. So he could maybe do a better job of doing that. Maybe it's the cover artist who could have done a better job. But I'll try this and maybe other Johnstones as they cross my path. He's written a ton of books. Maybe it's time I gave a few more of them a look-see. And then for week 4 of June on the Range, Michael K. Vaughn. Now keep in mind, these parameters are his. They're in his video. They don't have to be yours. Read whatever Westerns you want. Join us in this once towering and now almost dead genre of fiction. But for his 4th week, he's picking an epic. The greatest Western novel ever written. And that is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. Now, I am really tempted to do that too. I had originally planned to do a read-along of Lonesome Dove for the whole of the month of June to coincide with June on the Range with Matthew at Mayberry Book Club. So maybe I will do that, and that will just count. It'll just float across the whole of June on the Range. We'll do a read-along of Lonesome Dove for every weekend in June. But I'm always up for a chance to reread this book. If you have heard about this book but you have not read it, you will have heard only superlatives about it, and there's a reason for that. I always want to tell people that. When you went 3 years hearing only superlatives about Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, including from me, that means the superlatives are true. That means it's a book you really should read. There's no reason to be in completely suspicious of that. The same thing is true with this book, only with this book you've been hearing superlatives for 40 years. And they are true. This is a great novel, an absolutely great novel, and hands down the best Western that's ever been written. No way to avoid it. There's no way to ignore it on June on the Range. So I'll figure out what I want to do. Maybe Matthew's not up for a read-along, but I could still be. So those are some books that I'll be doing for June on the Range. I hope you join us to read Westerns, especially those of you out there who've never really tried them. Which once upon a time, when Mark Richardson and I were young readers, if you can imagine that, fighting our way past the Tyrannosaurus Rexes, it would have been unthinkable for us to talk to an audience of thousands of avid readers and actually wonder, I don't know if any of you have ever read a Western. That's how ubiquitous they were. It would have been unthinkable that there were people out there who'd never read a Western. But now it's possible. Quite a few of you are under 40 years old. 40 years ago is about when this change started really taking root. It's about when Westerns as popular entertainment started dying. Helped on their way by ironic reflections on the Westerns. Like a certain Clint Eastwood movie that we will certainly be talking about in June on the Range, which I would argue was the last Western movie ever made. Because you need a certain amount of sincerity to do a Western. So the later parodies don't count. But anyway, there I go, digressing again. That is June on the Range. These are some of the books that I'm going to be reading. Louis the Moore novels don't typically take long, but Lonesome Gods is pretty long. So that whole week may be devoted to Louis L'Amour. But older books, the ones like these 3, these take no time at all. They're like 2 or 3 M&Ms to pop down. They take no time at all to read. And I may encounter more of them at the Brattle or elsewhere. So I may do a lot of that. And the same thing with the contemporary stuff. William Johnstone is not the only person writing contemporary Westerns that are legitimate, sincere Westerns that aren't meaning to subvert the genre. I might do a whole bunch of those as well. And because those are more modern books, they go the whole gamut. There are gay romances, there are lesbian romances, there are tentacle romances, there are supernatural romances, or westerns for all of these. So There's a lot more reading that can be done there, and then there's Lonesome Dove. So there'll be at least 2 behemoths, 2 chunkers in my June. But what about you? Are you willing to saddle up with this gang? I'll leave my fellow owl hoots down below. But we'd love to see you. We'd love to get everybody reading Westerns for the month of June. So I'll wrap this up. That was an announcement video, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.